Okay, wonderful. So yes, my name is Cathy Buerger. I am the Director of Research at the Dangerous Speech Project. We are a DC-based NGO, and we study the relationship between speech and violence, particularly looking at the impact of public speech on incidents of mass violence, intergroup violence. We also study productive responses to hateful and harmful speech. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about dangerous speech, what it is and how to identify it. And then we'll also talk a little bit about what we've learned in terms of how best to respond, what works and what doesn't always work. You know, this is a topic that I think is particularly relevant in the world that we're living in right now. I feel like I've been saying that since I started working at the DSP, and it continues to be true. And so I'm also going to try and talk a little bit about dangerous speech that we're seeing right now during the COVID-19 crisis. And that's also something I'd certainly be happy to try and answer questions about during the Q&A. So let's get started. Okay, so what is dangerous speech? I've said that term a few times now, and it is different than what you may have heard in reference to hate speech before, right? We do define these terms differently. We define dangerous speech as any form of expression that can increase the risk that people will commit or condone violence against members of another group. And the second part is really important for us, the idea of condoning violence. We know that even in the largest scale incidents of intergroup violence, it's usually only a very small percentage of the population that is actually committing the violence, but a much larger percentage of the population is allowing it to happen, right? They're condoning it. And they might be doing that either through actively supporting the violence or by just staying quiet, by not feeling brave enough to stand up and say, stop, this isn't right. So we're really interested in the kinds of public speech that can move people toward either of those positions, right? Either being willing to actually commit violence or being willing to allow it to happen. The concept of dangerous speech emerged from research into the public speech that preceded several large incidents of historical mass violence. So our executive director, Susan Benish, coined the term after noticing remarkably similar rhetorical patterns coming up in the speech that preceded incidents of mass violence across languages, cultures, countries, and historical periods. She kept seeing these same patterns, these same tropes coming up in language. And these are things that we refer to as the hallmarks of dangerous speech. Now, one of them I'm sure you have heard of, which is dehumanization. So any kind of speech that refers to members of another group as less than human, often things like vermin, rats, insects, anything that if you found it in your house, you would want to get it out, right? So that's kind of a general description of dehumanization. And that's a very powerful hallmark of dangerous speech, but it's not the only one. Another one is accusation in a mirror. This one actually emerged, that term came from a propaganda manual that was found after the Rwandan genocide. And accusation in a mirror is a tool used by speakers to convince people that violence is necessary. And the way they do that is by saying that members of the outgroup are about to commit a particular crime or an act of violence or something like that to members of an in-group, when in fact they are trying to commit that same violence against members of an outgroup. So to give an example, it would be like saying, those people are going to come and burn down our village, when in fact the people that are hearing that message are part of a group that is either planning to go burn down the other group's village or is already burning down their village. And this is a really powerful hallmark of dangerous speech because it shifts violence from being seen as possible to being seen as necessary, because it puts people in a frame of mind of self-defense, right? We have to take this action to prevent the threat that's coming to us. There are other hallmarks as well. So things like invasion rhetoric, things like describing members of the outgroup as a contaminant that is, a threat to the purity of the in-group. Or one that we see really, really frequently, and it comes up often right before outbreaks of violence, is an assertion that a member of the outgroup has attacked or raped or harassed a woman or a child of the in-group. right? So these are patterns that we see over and over again in the speech that kind of prepares the ground for mass violence. But we can't look just at the message, right? I could come on this call tonight and share lots of dehumanizing speech about a particular group, and my guess is that none of you would be moved to go commit violence or support violence against members of another group. And there are lots of reasons for that, right? So whenever we look at dangerous speech or at a message to determine whether or not it's dangerous, we don't just look at that particular message. We have to look at the entire context. So we're looking at things like speaker. Does the speaker have particular authority over that audience? Are they very charismatic? Are they someone that the audience has reason to fear? Do they actually have power over that audience and can kind of compel them to do what they say? All of those things can make a message more powerful, right? We also look at the audience. Are there any factors in the audience that might make them more likely to be obedient to that speaker? Are they particularly fearful already? Are they victims of violence in the past? Not necessarily of the same group that they're in a conflict with now, but have they been victims of other violence that might make those claims of danger feel really imminent? Are they competing for resources? Are resources scarce? You know, are there other things that are making their situation particularly precarious? We also look at the social and historical context. So social and historical context is really like almost everything else, right? There are lots of things that can fit into that category. That can be things like history of tension between the two groups. It can also be one that we see really frequently actually is the legal context in the country. So are the two groups in question, do they have the same legal rights or not, right? What about the international community? How do these groups, do they have power in the international system? Are there other things happening in the world that make this situation particularly dire? Things like drought or a pandemic, right? These are things that can affect how people might hear and internalize a message relaying a sense of threat. Medium is an interesting category. I think one that can be overlooked by some. Medium is the way that the message is spread, right? So this is, you know, things like, is the message spread in person or is it spread on Facebook or on TV? But it can also mean things like what language is being used to spread that message. So when our executive director was doing research in Kenya during the post-election violence, many people told her, you know, when I hear a message in English or in Swahili, I hear it with my head. But when I hear it in the language of my hometown, I hear it with my heart. You know, I think this is something that many of us kind of intuitively understand. I'm from Indiana originally, and I haven't lived there in quite some time, but even now when I meet someone from Indiana who might speak a certain way or use particular words that I don't hear as frequently where I live now, there's part of me that goes, home, right? And I study this for a living. Like I understand what's happening kind of in my brain when this happens, but I still feel that. We relate to messages really differently depending on the words that are used, even the cadence that can be used. So all of those things can kind of fit into medium and can make a message potentially more or less dangerous. And so one thing that's important to know is that we don't see this as a quantitative assessment, right? We don't assign points to each one and say it's 10% message and 20% speaker. For us, this is a qualitative assessment. And you're trying to gather as much information as you can and trying to make a very well-educated guess about the likelihood that these messages will lead someone to support violence, right? Okay, something else to think about is that when we're thinking about the difference between dangerous speech and hate speech, is that dangerous speech is usually speech that is conveying a sense of fear. It's conveying a threat, not necessarily focused on hatred. The two categories do overlap. There's certainly a lot of hateful speech that can be dangerous, but there's also lots of really ugly, unkind, and hurtful speech that might not necessarily move someone toward violence. For all of the reasons that we just discussed, right? You have to take into account this 5-part framework. There can also be speech that is very dangerous that might not be hateful. So if, for example, a speaker told a community, those people in that other community, they're coming to our community tonight and they are going to murder all the women, right? If there was reason for that community to believe that message, to feel that there was a possibility that that might happen, that might be a really dangerous message. It might really convince them that they needed to go take action against the other community before that community came to hurt them. Now, that message is not on its surface hateful. It doesn't contain any slurs. It doesn't contain any specific threats being made against that other community. It's not in itself, explicitly justifying an action that will be taken. This is not a message that would be caught up in a social media algorithm, for example. Algorithms are not designed to catch things like that, and it would be very hard for them to do that because of all this other context that has to be there to make that assessment. But so there's certainly dangerous speech that isn't hateful or obviously hateful, right? So one good example is when we think back about the Ebola epidemic in the Democratic Republic of the Congo last year. During this time, rumors swirled that Ebola was a hoax, right? That the elite in the country had conceived of this as a way to further hurt the less powerful. There's a real skepticism of authority in this country, in part because they've had such a long history of conflict. And in many times, the poor really have been used as political pawns by powerful groups who are fighting their own conflicts, right? There were also rumors swirling that healthcare workers were being paid for each person that they collected and brought to an Ebola treatment facility where they would then be left to die. And in the context of this, there were many documented attacks against healthcare workers, some that ended up being deadly, right? Now, there's a lot of discussion about who started these rumors and why. But I think what's clear is that there were many people who spread the rumors with the best of intentions, right? They weren't doing it because they wanted to harm healthcare workers necessarily. They did it because they wanted to protect their loved ones. We know that in frightening times, right, where there are other reasons for people to be scared, where they can't get good information about what's happening, people share messages, especially ones that are scary or that that people might think might help protect someone. They share them very quickly. Things can go viral in communities. They can be spread really, really quickly. And so rumors take off. And even if those rumors are being spread with the best of intentions, to help loved ones, sometimes they can still be really, really dangerous. So that's another thing to think about with dangerous speech. Sometimes it is really horrible intent by people to spread this, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just people wanting to warn their loved ones. That doesn't make it any less dangerous, though. All right, so let's talk about our current situation. In the wake of the COVID-19 epidemic, or pandemic, I should say, we've seen lots of troubling examples of dangerous speech. And there are many researchers and organizations out there that are documenting really stark increases in anti-Chinese and anti-Asian speech. And I think we're probably all kind of aware that that's happening. But there are also researchers that have documented increases in anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant speech. All of these groups are, in their own way, either being blamed for the pandemic or being blamed for trying to profit off the pandemic. And it's not just speech, right? We are seeing an increase in attacks against people, especially against Asians right now. One example, this picture here comes from the Ukraine. I think a few months ago, a small mob tried to stop a convoy of buses that was carrying evacuees out of Wuhan, China, where the pandemic began, to a health spa in the Ukraine where they would be quarantined and avoid the pandemic, right? Now, a rumor had spread over email before this that the people in the buses were actually not evacuees escaping the pandemic, but were actually people who were infected with the virus. So the mob gathered. As you can see here, there were bricks that people were throwing, attempting to break the windows on the buses. which is maybe also not a great strategy if you're trying to contain a disease, but we'll leave that aside. So trying to break the windows on the buses, starting fires to try and prevent the bus from entering the town. And this was all started with a rumor, right? So when people are afraid and they're trying to protect themselves, people might be more willing to take a dangerous action, or again, to allow that violence to happen. It's certainly something that we are seeing now in relation to this. Okay, so what do we do about it, right? We know that these messages exist. We know that they spread really, really quickly online these days. One message can reach thousands of people or more in less than a minute. I think there's a real kind of a feeling among many people that we just need to remove that speech. We need to get as much hateful, hurtful, dangerous speech off, offline, like not off, but like pull it off our social media accounts as quickly as possible. And that is what we need to focus on. But we also know that it can have really big ramifications, right? Especially in terms of freedom of expression. We also know that in countries that have really that have laws against certain kinds of speech or have more restrictive speech norms and laws, those laws are often applied really unevenly because it's difficult to apply them evenly, even if you're really trying to. They are often used to silence political opposition. They're used to silence minority voices. So I think, at our organization, we have a really large sense of skepticism that is the way we should proceed, right? So one of the things that we have been doing is studying what we call alternative user-led responses. And that's a long way of basically saying people who choose to respond to hatred when they see it. And these are not like companies, this is not Facebook and Twitter. These are actually people who either as their job or after work come home and say, I'm going to try and fight against this hatred. I'm an anthropologist by training. And so I've been doing a digital ethnography of one of these groups for about a year now. And before that, I was doing kind of in-depth interviews with representatives from over 50 of these different efforts. Some of the efforts are really like one person that comes home after work and says, I'm going to do this for a couple of hours. Some of them are much more organized and have big advertising budgets and things like that. So a wide range of efforts. And, we have learned a lot about what these responses can do and what they can't do. Many of them fall into a category that we call counterspeech. Counterspeech is any direct response to a piece of speech that seeks to undermine it. Counterspeech has been touted by Facebook, right, as a potential cure for hatred, also as a potential way to battle extremism. The problem is that there isn't a lot of research out there on whether it's effective. And when we think about what's effective, what we mean by effective, right? A lot of people, when they hear that I study this, they say, oh, that's great, does counterspeech work? And I always say, well, that depends. What does it mean to work? So when I started this work, I obviously started by doing my research, right? I did a literature review. And if this is a topic that you're interested in, we do have an annotated bibliography on our website that you can access. But let me just tell you tonight kind of what we've learned from looking at the research that does exist. And I can tell you there's not that much out there. But what we do know is that it's very difficult to change the mind of someone who is posting hatred, right? We all kind of know that. We are remarkably good as humans at rejecting information that runs counter to what we currently believe or what we would like to believe, right? We are just really good at shutting that down. And so a lot of people see that and say, okay, so I guess that means that counterspeech doesn't work. But again, what do we mean by work? So one of the things that some studies have shown is that counterspeech is really, really effective at getting new counterspeakers to join the conversation, right? Of activating more people to speak up where they might not have before. We also know that the number of counterspeakers in a particular conversation matters. So does the tone of the conversation and the personal characteristics of the counterspeaker. So if the counterspeaker looks like me or is I perceive to be like me in a particular way, then they are more likely to be able to change my mind or behavior. all of these things kind of problematize this simple question of, does counter speech work? Because it reminds us that it's not one thing, right? There are so many different varieties, flavors of counter speech, if you will, out there, that we cannot easily answer, does it work, kind of yes or no. Now, I told you before that I have spent a couple of years looking into these different efforts, and I obviously don't have time to tell you about all of them, but I'd love to share 3 examples with you just to give you a perspective on kind of the variety of efforts that are out there, what they're trying to do, and what their goals are and their strategies to meet those goals. The first one is Daoud Walid. Daoud Walid is a Muslim activist. He lives in Dearborn, Michigan. And a few years ago, he wrote an essay called "Fellow Humans Are Not Abid." Abid is a derogatory term for slaves in Arabic, and it's often used to refer to Black Muslims. Now, Daoud realized that there were more people than he had heard in the past using this term, both online and in his community. And he really was offended by that. He knew the terrible history of the term, its origins, and he felt like people were using it in a very casual way that didn't represent the fact that it had this history. So he wrote this essay, which outlines the origins of the term. And then he went on Twitter and he searched for the term, both in English and in Arabic. And whenever he found it, he sent a direct message to that person with just a little note that said, "Hey, please read this," with a link to his essay. And he said there were 3 responses, 3 different kinds of responses that he got. The first one was no response, right? We can expect that. There were a lot of people that just ignored it. There was another group that doubled down on their usage, used it more frequently, at least in the short term, directed it at Walid, really just did the opposite of what he would want them to do. There was a third group, though, that responded really positively and said, "Hey, thanks for this," or, "My father always used this term and I didn't realize its origin. I didn't know what it meant." And this is kind of a classic counter speech relationship, right? Person A encounters bad speech, says something to person B. It's all done in private, right? There was no aspect of shaming in this because they were direct private messages. The goal was education. And this, again, also is the kind of counter speech that is really difficult to do. It's trying to get someone to change their mind or behavior. The difference here is that Walid felt like the people that he was able to reach were often ones that weren't intentionally being super hateful. They just didn't know the history or the meaning of the term, right? So they're not necessarily completely changing their mind. They might just be changing their behavior. But this isn't the only way to do counter speech. This is Mina Dennert. Mina Dennert is an Iranian-born Swedish journalist and activist. And in 2016, she started a closed Facebook group, and she called it Jagarhar. Jagarhar means "I am here" in Swedish. And the way this group works is that they post links to newspaper articles that they have seen on Facebook that have hateful comments in the comment section. They post links to those in their group, and then members from the group collectively go on to that comment section and write counter speech. They write fact-based comments. They use, civil discourse to challenge dis and misinformation. They write supportive messages to people who are being attacked in the comment section. And here's the real trick of it. They tag their posts with #Jagarhar, and then they like each other's posts, right? So Facebook works where it amplifies comments that have the most interaction. So on public pages like newspaper, Facebook pages, the comments are not ranked in chronological order. They're ranked by which comments have the most interaction. So the goal of these groups is to push their comments to the top and bury the hatred. Their goal is not to remove the hatred. Their goal is to influence the larger conversation by making their comments the most visible. And research has shown that the first comments that someone reads in a comment section has almost a contagious effect on the tone of the rest of the comments below it. So if someone encounters a civil fact-based comment, they're more likely to write a similar comment. Whereas if they encounter an uncivil or an antisocial comment first, they are more likely to respond in kind, right? So this is a really interesting method. And I should say it's become really popular. The Swedish group has 75,000 people in it. And the group has been replicated in 14 countries around the world, and it's continuously growing. And this is the group that I've been doing the digital ethnography of for the past year. And I think one of the most interesting findings for me is that the members that I've spoken with have all talked about how this group has made them so much braver, about how before they didn't feel brave enough to counterspeak alone because they knew if they were one voice against a bunch of people posting hatred, they would be attacked, right? They would be what we call dogpiled. A lot of people would post hatred on their accounts. But if they are one in 100 people who's posting counterspeech, they feel braver. You know, some people have said, I have the group behind my cyber back. Or one person described tagging her comments with the hashtag as putting on armor. She puts on the hashtag like armor. So this is a really different way of doing counterspeech. And their effort, or their goal, I should say, is not to change anyone's mind posting hatred. They've kind of completely ignored them and say, you can post it, we'll just bury it below our comments. Their goal is to reach all of the other people who either haven't made up their mind, the movable middle, right? Or to inspire other people who didn't feel brave enough to counterspeak to begin counterspeech. So it's a really different way of thinking about what counterspeech can do. I'm gonna share one more. I know I've talked for a while. I'm almost done, I promise. One more example. This is an American example. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is a Twitter handle called Yes, You're Racist. A man named Logan Smith started this Twitter handle after Barack Obama was elected president. And he got really sick of hearing people say, oh, now we are a post-racial nation. And he was saying, no, we're not, right? So he went onto Twitter and he searched for the phrase, I'm not racist, but, and was horrified to see how many responses came back of people posting things like you see on this screen. I'm not a racist, but I don't get why people can't say racist things, right? And so he started this Twitter handle, Yes, You're Racist, and just started retweeting everything that he saw that was, I'm not a racist, but. So the Twitter handle itself became the counterspeech. He now has 380 something thousand followers. It's a huge following, right? And his effort is different again from the first two we've seen. Part of his goal is to educate other people that this racism still certainly exists, right? That we are still a nation that has a lot of racism in it. And his other goal, a secondary goal, is to shame people who are posting racist things, right? I think, and I know this because we've talked about this, he knows that that is not likely going to change their mind. Shaming someone is not a good way to get them to change their beliefs. It occasionally works to get them to change their behavior, right? If the social sanction is high enough, you might be able to kind of scare them off of posting that kind of thing, or at least scare them off of posting it here. Whether that might drive them into more extreme places where they're not hearing this counterspeech. You know, we haven't studied that. We don't know the larger impact of it. But I just wanted to share this because it's a very different take on counterspeech yet again. So I think that, you know, what we've really learned from looking at all of these different examples is that there's so many different ways to do counterspeech. There are so many different goals and strategies that align differently with those goals. But the one thing that kind of unites all of these is that they all work on this condoning group, right? Dangerous speech is any form of expression that can increase the risk that people will commit or condone violence against members of another group. You know, counterspeech might not have the power to convince someone who would be willing to actually commit violence against members of another group, to commit mass violence. But it might be really powerful at getting people to be brave enough to stand up and say, stop, or to help convince people who haven't quite made up their mind. I think that's the area that we really see counterspeech as having potential. It might not solve all of the problem, but it might, you know, being able to shrink that condoning group is really, potentially really powerful. So I know I've talked for a while. I'm going to stop here and start taking some questions. All right, so I'm going to put up my email address before I do this. If you have any questions, either later or if we don't get to them tonight, please do feel free to send me an email at any point. And we have lots of resources on our website, which is just www.dangerousspeech.org. All right. Let me get to the questions here. Okay, I'm going to read each question out loud and then do my best to answer them. So I see a question that says, staying quiet is safe. Can you recommend some form of intervention? Trying to kind of, I'm going to try and interpret that question, and if I miss it, then please ask it again if I don't answer it completely. It's absolutely true. Staying quiet is safe, right? It's very hard to put yourself out there and answer and, you know, make yourself visible in that way as a single counter speaker. And I think that that is what is so interesting about the I am here model that we've seen, is that because they work as a group, it helps remove some of that vulnerability. But that group isn't available everywhere. There actually was a US group for a while. It tried to start, they didn't really get traction. And the problem with these groups when they start is that if they're small, you don't really have that protection, and you don't have the way to have enough members to succeed, right? And so that group didn't really take off. But I think that there are also other ways to protect your identity online. There are also ways, I think, that are really powerful to not even put yourself out there and say explicitly, you know, this is wrong for this, and this answer, or for this reason, but even just to say, I don't feel like this is right. Does someone else want to jump in? You know, we have just some really early preliminary research, not huge results yet, but that even an invitation for others to jump in can be powerful and can encourage other people to join you. So it doesn't always have to be a complete response, I guess. Sometimes it's just trying to find your other allies that might be there in that conversation. Okay, the next question I see is, do you seek to understand the roots of hate speech? Yes. I think that, you know, it's not something that we have necessarily done a lot of independent research on, but we certainly rely on the great research that's being done by others that look at the connections, especially, and again, we don't study hate speech explicitly, we study dangerous speech, but again, the roots of hatred and how that's so frequently connected to identities of belonging and the way that we conceive of ourselves as a group and how we conceive of ourselves against something else, right? The best way to get people to feel as one is if they're fighting something else, right? And so we certainly are aware of some of that work, but it's not something that we research necessarily. The next question is, oh, they're jumping around on me, sorry, as people are posting more. Okay, how detrimental is it to public discourse when our political leaders are not held accountable for their speech in social media to the same standards as the general public? That is the question right now, right? Yeah, it's a huge problem. I assume that you're kind of referencing the newsworthy clause. If you're not, or if your others are not aware of this, sometimes people of high stature on social media are given a pass because their speech is considered newsworthy, right? So if it's something that might be taken down, if I posted it, for example, if someone holding a very important political office posted it, it might not be taken down, again, because it's newsworthy. It's something that people, the platforms have determined that people should see it because it's making news. I think, you know, if we think about this from a dangerous speech perspective, that's the opposite of what should happen, right? The people that have the most influence, their speech has the most power to potentially be really dangerous. So yeah, I think it's definitely detrimental to public discourse. How do you rate Trump and dangerous speech? Yeah, there's a lot there. There are some blog posts on our blog that address specific things that he has said. In terms of invasion rhetoric is one that comes up a lot with Donald Trump, right? And again, when you look at the authority of the speaker, you have that there, right? If you look at the audience, again, it would depend on the audience, right? Donald Trump might not be able to convince me to go and want to commit violence or allow it to happen. But certainly there is an audience that might be really feeling a lot of precarity, whether it's economic precarity or social precarity, that might be more willing to hear that as an imminent threat. When we hear Trump talking about rapists, or this came up a lot with the migrant caravan, right? If you even look at the news coverage of that, you know, showing this, what looked like a swarming herd of people that were just coming to the border that were going to attack us, right? So you even can look at the way that images are shown. Absolutely, absolutely, there's dangerous speech there. The next question, okay, this is a long one. Does all political speech have the potential to incite violence? Okay, I'm gonna read the whole question first. Also, how should we think about dangerous speech which is true, or at least partially true? If research on climate change incites violence against executives in the fossil fuel industry, what then? Does this necessitate a separate conversation on who can be characterized in dangerous speech terms? I have to think about this one for a little bit. So certainly some dangerous speech can be true. It's often false, but it does not have to be false for it to be dangerous, right? I still think that there is a difference between describing someone as a threat. There's still something else that has to happen between describing someone as a threat or describing a group of people. And again, remember that dangerous speech is always something that is targeting groups, right? It's not just that this person is, you know, coming through the door of your house about to kill you. It's talking about group characteristics. And we are a little bit more flexible when we think about the term group than like genocide convention. We're not, we look at things like professions. So journalists is one that comes up a lot, right? But it does have to be group targeted speech. So I think that there is still a difference about that would need to be made in a different way from talking about research on climate change to then for some reason saying that all executives in the fossil fuel industry deserve to be killed, right? There's still a big jump that happens that I think we would consider if that rhetorical jump might be dangerous speech. Does it necessitate a separate conversation on who can be characterized in dangerous speech terms? I don't know. I mean, I think that when we think about social groups, we are very open to looking at lots of different groups that might be characterized, and this is not. It can be, yeah, on many different sides, in many different ways. I'm sorry if that's not a full answer for that question. Okay, how do you counter false information? This is really tricky. Like I said, it's really, really hard to get someone who has made up their mind about an issue to change their mind. We had a gathering of counter speakers about 1.5 years ago. We brought people together who normally, you know, work in an isolated setting on their computer. We brought them into a room in Berlin, lots of them together, and said, okay, let's talk. Like, what issues do you face? What challenges do you face? What works? What doesn't? And this issue is one that they came back to over and over again. They said that the hardest people to counterspeak against are the people that can point to some study, right? Some fraudulent study that backs up their point. And regardless of how much other information you throw at them, how many other studies you say, but look, all these other studies disprove what you believe, as long as that person can say, but look, it's written right here. It's really, really hard to get them to change their mind. What I think is the upside to that is that these conversations that are happening online, if you're thinking about this, at least in an online setting, that you're not only focused on that one person who might be kind of posting this information. There are a lot of other people who might be reading it saying, oh, I don't know, is that true? Is that not true? This is this term I used earlier, the movable middle, right? Those are the people that you can really effectively counter disinformation with. by pointing out things like, oh, you know, maybe we should check what this source is, and trying to do it. I think the other thing is that trying to do it in a way that remains civil and polite, even if that is not kind of how you are feeling in the moment, can be really important, again, because again, you're trying to reach these other people who might not know. And if someone is made to feel stupid or inadequate, it's probably not going to be the kind of situation where someone might be open to challenging their beliefs, right? But again, looking at sources, trying to post other information where you have it, or even just asking questions, right? This is one of the things that the I Am Here group does a lot, is trying to ask people questions. You know, why are you feeling that way? What about this makes you feel like it's true? Because once you can kind of get to some of those root beliefs, then it's actually a little bit easier. It's still not easy, but then you actually kind of know the argument you're working with, right? Are people believing it because they had a relative who had something similar happen to them, right? Is that what they're dealing with? Is it that they really believe that particular news source for some reason? So I think asking questions is a good way to start. Okay, the next one. How to get people ostensibly on my own side to stop posting hatefully and inflammatorily. Like, someone will start a reasonable conversation or question, and they're always either vicious, smarmy, condescending, insulting. Yep, who would listen to that? Exactly what I was just saying. A lot of the time, they're actually bringing up good points and arguments, but they burn it all down by being obnoxious about it. It's hard. And sometimes you can't do anything about it. Sometimes what you can do is try and counter it and post a different kind of message, right? Like I said, the research out there on what social scientists call contagion is really strong. That tone within particular conversations is really contagious. So if you can try and post something that's different, and hopefully other people may like it, or also feel encouraged to write in the same way that you do, then hopefully that tone can kind of take over. But I hear you that can be a really frustrating thing, especially when we all, I think, can understand that desire, right? Regardless of what side of an issue you're on, sometimes it just feels really good to be kind of nasty in responding to it, because it's how we feel. And it's funny, you know, I talked to people in the I Am Here group about this, and I said, because they have pretty strict guidelines for how they should talk, not necessarily what they should say, but they should be polite, they should not attack someone else. And I asked, you know, do you always follow the rules? And some of them said yes, and some of them said no, but when I don't use the hashtag, right? So if I'm like posting in group business, I always follow the rules. But sometimes they said you just have to, you just lose control and you have to do it. But it's not necessarily productive, right? It doesn't accomplish, at least if the goal is to get someone to change their mind, it doesn't accomplish that goal. What we have learned, again, from looking at all of these different examples, is that if your goal is just to kind of go viral within people who are on your side, right? If you're just trying to make something well known among people who already think like you, then that kind of humor can be really effective, right? So it really depends on kind of what you're trying to do with the speech. But yeah, if you're really trying to reach people on the other side, or people who are unsure right now, it's usually not that effective. Okay. Do you align your group or partner with other equal rights groups to build a larger audience? We have done research with other organizations, and we participate in coalitions. We're a member of the Change the Terms Coalition, for example, which is pushing for kind of different behavior from social media companies. We're part of several atrocity prevention communities of practice as a way to build out our community, because we are a very small organization. So yeah, we do definitely have relationships with lots of organizations. Okay, what other platforms besides Twitter and Facebook? There's a lot. I think maybe this is asking where we see dangerous speech or where we do research. I'm not sure. So dangerous speech can be on any platform. I think some of the other platforms to watch right now that are having a major impact on political discourse, certainly YouTube. There's a lot going on YouTube. What else? Instagram, obviously. Pinterest is an interesting one. Pinterest has actually taken some pretty strong stances on the kinds of information that they will allow there. For example, they don't allow kind of anti-vaccine posts, and every time you search for a vaccine, it will direct you to like official health information about vaccines. So they have interesting kind of terms of moderation. Another one that is really kind of in, I think, the public mind right now, because we're all stuck at home on our computers all day, is TikTok. TikTok is something that there's not been a lot of research on because it's kind of emerging in our world right now, right? But we are starting to do some research on TikTok because they have interesting practices relating to censorship, how they ban things, what they allow users to do. For example, that users can block particular words that will show up in the comments. So you could potentially, if you knew what how people would respond, you could potentially like block counter speech within your comments that was responding to the content posted. So those are some other platforms that are kind of interesting to look at on this topic. Okay, the next question, and Rhoda, please, if I keep going over time, if I go over time, please feel free to jump in. I'm just going to keep reading. Does that make sense?
No problem.
Okay. The next question is, have you and your colleagues at the Dangerous Speech Project seen a change in the nature or intensity of dangerous speech over time? Has mass anonymity made people more bold in how they've spoken out? This is a hard question to answer. I think, you know, anecdotally, we might say, yes, it feels like that, but it's really hard to study, in part because, first of all, social media is relatively new, right? So we don't have a great kind of baseline from what to study because people have become more connected. And so more speech is now visible to us than would have been earlier. Secondly, I think people are becoming more aware that this is a problem. And so it's being reported on more frequently. So whenever, that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't exist before, but it means that people weren't reporting about it before in the same way they are now, right? Mass anonymity is an interesting question. And the research is kind of split on this, actually. I think we would assume that the more anonymous you are, the more likely you would post hateful things, right? As you say, it would be more bold in how they've spoken out. But there is some research within particular platforms, I think, and this is not research that I know well, so I would encourage you, if this is something you're really interested in, please send me an email and I will fact check myself before you kind of spread this information. But I believe it's on, the research was on 4chan or 8chan that talked about that the people who had some kind of identity tracker, whether it was a flag or something like that, having identity being somewhat visible made people more likely to post extremely hateful things. I'm not sure on that though. That's my memory. But there has one thing that's related to this is that there have been some people who have stopped posting incredibly hateful, violent things once they were doxxed, right? So once their public information was shared and they were identified, possibly because they were afraid of repercussions, possibly because someone they knew in their community found out and said something to them. We don't know why, right? But there were a couple of very high profile cases where someone who was notably hateful online then had their identity revealed and stopped posting hateful stuff online. So I think you're right in your guess with this, but I think that there is some research that suggests that it might not be quite as simple as that. So the next question is, more of my energy is spent fighting with people who are on my side, trying to get them to not be asshats, sorry, the person writes, rather than actually dealing with anyone spreading dangerous speech. I think that's true. And that's partially because we so rarely actually encounter people from other kind of ideological communities. Although being online can make that somewhat more possible, right? We may have kind of sorted ourselves ideologically in terms of geography, but especially on things like Facebook, where we're often friends with people we went to school with as children, we do get a somewhat wider base. But yeah, even then, we don't always interact together. Okay, the next question. Does reporting certain kinds of speech on Facebook effective at all? So is reporting certain kinds of speech on Facebook effective at all? Sometimes is the best that I can tell you. It depends on the situation, and it depends on how many people report it. I think that and again, we don't actually have data on this because the social media companies are not transparent at all. And this is one of our big issues at the Dangerous Speech Project that we're always pushing, is it's incredibly hard to do research on what works in responding to dangerous and hateful speech on social media when social media companies don't tell you at all what they do. Right? They're not public or transparent with any of this content about like how many reports they receive versus what they take down. And they do, you know, in an effort to be transparent, or at least to look transparent, they do share stats on this, but there's a lot of question about kind of about what actually happens, right? So I think that also really depends on where you are in the world. There are lots of countries where Facebook is the one I know best, you know, has very few people on staff who read in the language of that country. So I don't know how familiar you are all with this, but the ethnic cleansing that is happening in Myanmar right now, that Facebook has really been held to account for, and the UN, you know, has said they are complicit in this ethnic cleansing because so much terrible speech was shared over Facebook. Before Mark Zuckerberg was called to the Senate to testify about this situation, before that, they had maybe 2 or 3 people on staff that spoke Burmese, right? And this was while this was happening. This is while, I mean, people who were not working at Facebook were aware that this was happening on Facebook. And only after the Senate hearing did they devote any kind of resources to employing more people who spoke Burmese. And even then, it wasn't many. So I think that's one challenge in terms of reporting, is it even being seen? It's also an issue right now with the pandemic because the social media companies are relying much more heavily on AI than they've always relied heavily on AI, but their kind of human eyes that would review things have been sent home, right? Because they're not able to work in the same way that they were before. And so it's, again, an impact of the pandemic. And if you're interested in that issue, I would point you toward an essay that was written by our executive director, Susan Benish. If you're interested in that, send me an email. I'm happy to send you a link. All right, the next question. This just feels like a losing battle with our current president, who absolutely condones and spews dangerous speech. It's so combative, it's exhausting. I'm trying to be hopeful, but really struggling. I'm just gonna leave that one there. Okay, have you researched on how much economic and social inequality give rise to dangerous speech? Not specifically, no, I don't have that research available. I think, you know, it's something that we think about a lot within the atrocity prevention community, and think about the way that economic precarity overlaps with, and kind of resource scarcity overlaps with conflict and violence, intergroup violence. But we don't have specific research on how it gives rise to dangerous speech. Okay. Next question. What percentage of dangerous speech comes from real people or outside bots? Has there been a study? There has not been a study on that at all. I don't think we have a comprehensive study of kind of all of the dangerous speech that's out there. And it would be really hard, again, because it's so context dependent to be able to evaluate each piece of speech. It's not something that we can easily kind of grab in a large way because it's not tagged by keywords. We can't, people always, you know, ask us, well, what are the words? If you tell us the words, we can make an AI that will grab all the dangerous speech, but it's not just words. So it's even really hard just to get a count of kind of how much dangerous speech there is. So I don't know how much comes from real people or bots. Okay, next one. In today's world, can a person yell fire falsely in a space full of people, have people hurt in the resulting stampede, and not suffer any consequences? I think that depends on the situation. It depends on the person. is probably what I would say. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the actual law on that. And I think that also really depends on the particular country in which we're talking about this, right? There are countries that are very, are trying to put in place laws that really hold people accountable for stuff like this, or more frequently, or more recently, I should say, are holding social media companies accountable for this. Germany passed a really well-known Network Enforcement Act, I think, a couple of years ago. And what this did was tried to hold social media companies responsible for any speech that they allowed to remain on their platforms that violated national law, right? So German law is relatively extensive in the kinds of speech that it discourages and prohibits, I should say. And so social media company, and they would be fined if they did not remove this quickly. I forget the number of hours, but it was 1 to 3 days, somewhere in that range. And they really struggled with doing this well, right? Because they had to rely on AI because it had to be done quickly. And social media companies really erred on the side of pulling things down because they didn't want to be fined. And so it caught up things like, one of the famous ones that it caught up was a satire website that was, so first of all, they removed a comment that was made by a politician. And then I think a day or two later, they removed a satire that was mocking that politician, right? And then they also notably removed a picture of a street sign. It was like a triangle and it had bumps on it, 2 bumps that were supposed to indicate there was a bump in the road, and someone had hung a bikini over those 2 bumps, so it looked like a chest, right? And that picture was posted, and so they took that down. And so it was just it was difficult to put this in to enforce that law in a way that people felt like was equitable and was useful. Yeah. The next question. Who gets to be the arbiter of dangerous speech? It's clear that big tech is unable or unwilling to manage it. Yeah, it's really hard. I think that it also requires a really deep understanding of a particular context. We have a program called the Global Research Initiative Fellowship, where every year we award fellowships to researchers from around the world to write about dangerous speech that's happening in their own contexts. Because even though, we are researchers who study this for a living, we still know that we can't possibly understand all of the nuances that some of these messages might have within a particular context. So it's really something that becomes, I think that many of us, right, could look for the hallmarks of dangerous speech. Those are relatively obvious. And then detailed analyses can be done by people who live in the context or understand them at a very deep level. But it is something that would be really hard to do through AI, right? It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any movement. And I think that, Twitter, I think last year, revamped their dehumanization policy and relied on some of our research to help do that. So there are bits and pieces of our theory that has made its way into tech company policy, largely as an explanation of kind of why this matters, right? Why you should be looking at dehumanization, why you should be looking at speech like this. But it's difficult. How does the use of propaganda fit into this pattern? I think I might not be getting this question correctly, but I think that it comes back to this idea that there is some dangerous speech that is spread really kind of in a well-intentioned way, but there is also plenty of dangerous speech that is especially developed to be propaganda, right? That it is useful for someone, whether it is the actual speaker or someone else, to have one group fearing another group, right? Whether it's because that leader wants to commit violence and would like the population to support them in doing so. That can be a really, that can be a way that dangerous speech becomes political propaganda, right? As a way to make a population feel afraid and that you are the only one as leader who can save them from that danger. that's something that we do see in many different contexts around the world. So I think that maybe that's how it fits with propaganda. Okay, that was the last question. I have 3 more questions, it looks like. Okay. It seems to me that dangerous speech has a place in human communication and interactions since really the beginning of human history, sadly. Yep, I agree. My question is, are we in a new age of dangerous speech because of the rapid change brought on by the advent of information age hallmarked by the internet, social media, and mass communication means like computers and cell phones? Is this information age we live in today a step change, in your opinion, on same the order of Gutenberg and printed word and its ability to amplify the spread of hate speech? Yeah, I've kind of touched on this in some other questions. Speech does move really, really quickly right now. And, you know, some tech companies, so I'm thinking about like WhatsApp, have put in place particular protections so that speech can be slowed down a little bit. This happened actually in India. I think it was last year, it might have been the year before. They had a problem in India where there were rumors spreading about people that were coming into villages on motorcycles and abducting children. And there was a video actually that was edited, right? So it was initially a commercial that was put out by an NGO in Pakistan, I believe. And it had an image of a child being abducted, and then the person came back and it said, abduction can happen in a minute, protect your children. That was like the message. But this video was trimmed, so it only showed the child being abducted and sped off on a motorcycle. And that this video then circulated on WhatsApp, and WhatsApp used to be able to, you know, to forward to groups that had 10,000 people in them or something like that. And so it very quickly reached lots of people, and people were saying, you know, watch out because there are strangers coming to these villages on motorcycles and they're going to take your children. Because of these rumors, there were many people, maybe not many, there were people who were attacked by vigilante mobs and killed because they were assumed to be these outsiders that were coming into villages, right? This was a huge problem for several months. And WhatsApp put in new restrictions where people could only forward messages to a certain number of people. And each time that it was forwarded, I think this actually is still in existence even on ours, that if you get something that was forwarded, so not written from the person that sent it to you, it will say forwarded message. Because again, when we think about, do we trust this message? It feels really different if we believe that our mother sent us something that she wrote, or if it was something that our mother just forwarded along that someone else wrote, right? So they're trying to find ways to give people more information and to slow down the spread of speech. But it still doesn't, I mean, it's true that speech spreads really quickly. But the other thing that I will say on a more hopeful note is that the internet also allows us to encounter speech that we disagree with, which provides opportunities for counter speech that may not have existed before. Right? Because speech is more public in some ways, it allows us to see what's happening and potentially try and respond. There's a social media scholar named Dana Boyd who has written about the context collapse that happens on social media, right? Where before we used to have a particular audience that we were speaking to, and there were kind of barriers between who was our audience now and the people who were not our audience. And we don't have those anymore on social media. That something you say can be amplified well beyond who you think you're speaking to. And because we have these collapsed contexts, all of a sudden we meet people who have really different speech norms than we do. And so it allows opportunities for counter speech that weren't there before. Okay, looks like 2 more questions. Do you have any sense of how prevalent dangerous speech is and how it may be increasing? Like I said, it's really hard to study how much dangerous speech there is right now. Like I said, we have feelings that there's a lot of it right now, and we can talk about the way that it is more prevalent in particular places, right? That it may have become more mainstream in certain places. We might see it being used in a way that is unapologetic. I wrote a blog post about this actually, I think it was sometime in the last year and a half, where Donald Trump retweeted videos that were not true, right? And they were suggesting that that they showed violence that was being committed by Muslims, right? And what struck me that was so important about these was not that the videos themselves were so much more dangerous than anything that he had said before, but that the White House's response to it had changed. Before, when there were things that were potentially kind of dangerous speech that the president had posted, the staffers always said, oh, that's not what he meant, or he didn't say that. And this time, the people said, yeah, that's what he meant. They are dangerous, right? And so I think we can talk about the way discourse norms, the Overton window has shifted to what is seen as acceptable speech right now. And in some ways, that is even more important to think about than the actual kind of amount of dangerous speech, is whether some of those barriers against it have changed more recently. And again, that would have to be something that you would look at in individual contexts, right? I don't think we have the data. I don't think it would be accurate to say that that's happened kind of across the board in every country in the world. Okay, so how do we counter dangerous speech? What can each of us personally do to fight it? I think that remembering that you don't have to change the person's mind, right? So you can say something to even just saying, I don't think that's right. You don't always have to go beyond that, but documenting dissent to something that you see can be incredibly powerful. Because if somebody else is reading that and they say, I don't know if this is right, and they see a voice saying, that's not right, then all of a sudden they say, okay, I was right to think it wasn't right, right? That even just documenting dissent is powerful. Certainly if you have expertise on the topic and you can explain why it's not right, that also can be useful to other people who might encounter that conversation. So that's another strategy that you can use. But like I said, even just opening space, so many of the counter speakers that I've interviewed have said they see their main role as just making space for conversation. That often when there's lots of hatred and dangerous speech, it doesn't feel like there's any way to kind of wiggle into that conversation. It doesn't feel safe to insert yourself into that conversation. And so lots of the people that I've spoken with who do this, as a practice, say that what they're trying to do is almost to like push back the walls of this bad speech so someone else feels like they can enter into that conversation. We're not, affecting the presence of hatred, but we might be able to impact the effect of that hatred by bringing in other voices and helping people who might read that, helping counter it, might make sure that that speech doesn't spread beyond that particular place. All right, that's the last question. I think you're muted, Rhoda. Rhoda, I think you're muted.
Should be, now I'm unmuted. My host unmuted me. Anyway, thank you so much, Cathy, because that was very informative. And I think we had some great questions. And it's really sad that our leaders are so outspoken and provoking so much hate speech that it appears that to counter it, we have to be better organized to do so as well. If anybody continues to have questions, you can send them to info@nfrpp.org. We'll get in touch with Cathy. And Cathy, we hope to bring you back as your research unfolds and you have more to tell us. So that was great. Thank you so much. And to everybody else, thank you for being here, sticking with us. And please go to our website and check on the programs that are coming up. So thanks again, and see you another time. Bye-bye.
Bye.